so everybody has a copy. So again, we're going to start with Adam Smith, and Adam Smith is considered to be the political economy pioneer. He's the guy who essentially was a proponent of this idea of political economy. And what exactly is political economy? Well, it's kind of complicated, but essentially it's this sort of intersection between that occurs in a society between politics, um, the economy, social, cultural factors, and how they intertwine with or intersect with the production and distribution of wealth. And for him, right, he was a kind of a proponent on this idea of political economy, but the kind of a political economy that I'm going to talk about moving forward isn't exactly in the same vein as Adam Smith. Okay, so just bear that in mind, that cultural Marxism or Marxist political economy, at least the way the Frankfurt School saw it, is not exactly the same way that Adam Smith saw or perceived political economy. Now, one other thing to bear in mind was that he was very pro-capitalism, even though Adam Smith never lived in a society that was capitalistic. He was living in a society, I believe he was from the, was it 17th century, I want to say, or maybe 18th. I can't remember if he was born in 1723 and died in 1790, which 18th century, I believe, or maybe even, I can't remember exactly what century. But anyways, if someone wants to fact check, that'd be great. But you living under a society that was mercantilism. Does anybody know what mercantilism means? Anybody know what mercantilism means? No, we got one no. Any other no's? No.
A belief in the benefits of profitable trading.
Right, exactly right. But their belief in this idea of developing a surplus with trade, right, was based on the idea of um, focusing on exports, right? This idea that you export as many goods as you possibly can into the marketplace, make money off of that, and you rely very little on imports, right? And so imports, if they did receive imports, was essentially that you would put heavy taxes on these imports. And so the way Adam Smith saw this system, which by the way, also many people blame, or historians blame, this sort of system for the reason why European countries always seem to be at war, was because they oftentimes placed other countries in economic peril, and one way of getting out of economic peril is we'll start war. And so that's simplistic, but anyways, it's the general idea. But anyways, the way Adam Smith saw this economic system was that essentially people who controlled the export, right, the export trade, were the only ones really getting rich. And really, at the end of the day, because the tariffs on imports was so high, that it really wasn't a free market. In other words, the best products didn't automatically emerge as the products that people bought. So he believed in the idea of a free market, right? This idea that there should be a market where, you know, everybody's sort of competing on the same plane, and that the best products emerge in a marketplace. In other words, the idea of letting essentially the consumers, right, decide on what is best for them. But that wasn't happening under mercantilism because of high tariffs on imports. And so for anytime you had an imported good, there's no way it can compete with a good that was being produced within that particular country because the tariffs were so high. And it essentially made it unaffordable for those individuals living in that country. And so does everybody get that part? This is the reason why he was pro-capitalism, pro-free market, pro let the best products emerge naturally, which wasn't happening under mercantilism. Any questions? No questions. I see no comments, so I'm assuming that's no questions. So the other big thing that he believed in was this idea of the invisible hand theory. This idea that, entrepreneurs or business people act in their own best interests and they benefit society. And the way they're benefiting society obviously is through, anytime you're an entrepreneur, you hire folks, right, within your neighborhood or within, your country. And so that's going to benefit society because those individuals be able to provide for their families. So also under the invisible hand theory, the best products that best meet the consumer's needs emerge in a capitalistic free marketplace where everything's sort of equitable. So this idea of business people acting in their own best interests, he obviously, right, believed, he had a great deal of faith in people. He also had a deal of faith in the boss. This idea that the boss would be a good person, this idea that the boss would treat his employees well and therefore be able to provide them with a good salary that benefits society as a whole. So, I mean, is this true? I mean, are there great bosses in society?
I say yeah, but him relying on everyone being a good boss is kind of like unreasonable.
Right. It's a very almost what's the word I'm looking for? I can't remember. I can't pull it out of the air right now. Naive. It's a kind of a naive way of looking at bosses, right? Because as you mentioned, that yeah, sure, there are good bosses, of course, and of course, there's also some bad bosses, and the problem is the bad bosses, not necessarily the good bosses. The good bosses are actually, are good and practicing capitalism in the way that Adam Smith thought that it should be practiced, right? This idea that an entrepreneur benefits society. Not only are they getting rich, but they're helping society by helping their employees. And also because the best products under the invisible hand theory emerge as the best products because they best meet the needs of folks. Now, is that true? Do the best products under a capitalist society, do they emerge as the best ones that best meet the needs of consumers? Do products in capitalism, are they equitable in the 21st century?
Just like all products in general, or
Well, we can focus strictly on media or entertainment.
um, I guess it depends really who you ask. In terms of quality, some people might say maybe not the best. And some others might say that, oh, that's where I get all my news, or I'm not entirely sure. you
Right.
know,
Well, that's a good response because um, I'm not entirely sure either. Right. It just depends on what do we mean by a consumer's needs? Best meet their consumers' needs. So that's the question, and that question is different for everyone. But um, my hypothesis would be that no, the best products don't emerge as necessarily the best ones that best meet the customer's needs. At least not right now in the 21st century. Maybe moving forward, sure. The other thing that Adam Smith believed in is this idea of the home bias, this idea that business people, because they care so much about their domestic economy and they care so much about their country, they're not going to outsource jobs to other countries, right? Even if, right, they make more of a profit from hiring international employees versus domestic employees, that business people would not outsource jobs. He believed in this idea of the home bias that at the end of the day, the entrepreneur cares very much about the people within his country, even more so that they care more about those people than they care about money. We know that's not true as well. So goods, always get outsourced or often get outsourced to international workers. And so, right, what I'm trying to get at is that Adam Smith had a great deal of faith on on the boss, right? He had a great deal of faith on in these entrepreneurs that they would make society a better place. They would practice capitalism in a responsible way that would benefit society. That would be that capitalism, in his opinion, even though he didn't live in capitalism, he lived in mercantilism, would ultimately be a much better model for people than mercantilism, because the way he saw mercantilism, there was only a handful of folks that were getting rich within that particular economy, and that capitalism was a much more equitable system, and that there would be much more people profiting off of capitalism, becoming rich under capitalism. There'd be much more happier employees under capitalism than under mercantilism. But again, he never lived in under capitalism. He died before there was such thing as capitalism. Now, other things that he was wary of, he was very wary of monopolies. He thought that eventually, right, what would happen in a monopoly, because it was the only good in the marketplace, that essentially that particular company, right, would essentially keep elevating the prices of goods, and so therefore that would hurt consumers because there was no competition. There was just one particular company, right, selling that particular good. That was no good for consumers. And even the US in general is pretty good about trying to stay away from monopolies. I think that we are pretty good about not trying to have too many monopolies in too many places, generally speaking, although it's kind of changing over time. Right now we have a whole lot of oligopolies. Okay, so the other thing that he was very wary of was this idea of businesses dominating a political system that influenced political policy. So this idea of lobbying, right? He was not for it at all. He thought that government and business should be two separate things, and those two things should not intersect necessarily, at least not in the way that they intersect nowadays. This idea that a company, right, can pay money to Congress and to get Congress to vote in a certain sort of way is something that Adam Smith would be very wary of. I don't think he would be in favor, or he'd be very leery of having a system where you have um, businesses, right, lobbying on behalf of certain policies. You guys have all, I don't know how many of you have taken Comm law, but I know Professor Erickson, if you've taken her, talks about this, the idea of PACs and how they influence voting, right? And so Adam Smith, even though he was both pro-capitalist and political economy pioneer, was very weary of business trying to get policies passed that would benefit them in government. So the other thing that he was in favor of was this idea that government needed to examine any laws that benefited commerce very carefully. So he didn't like the idea of overregulating, but he also felt that, there needed to be some sort of regulation, at least a little bit of oversight, because um, this idea of the responsible entrepreneur, even though he had a lot of faith in them, he said that, well, then sometimes they would need to be checked, right? So in other words, you just couldn't have, let's say, a company just polluting our environment, for instance, right? They needed to be sort of held in check by government, needed to sort of regulate a little, but not over-regulate. So this sort of fine line between a little regulation, but not over-regulation if that makes any sense. Now, the other things that he felt that were interesting, or necessary, I should say, was that he felt that government should focus on government for the most part, and not put its foot in too much in what business entrepreneurs are doing, and that government should only focus on things that they can sort of control. So, for instance, he felt that government should focus on things like education, for instance, because Adam Smith acknowledged the fact that capitalism could hurt the poorest people. The people who had the less amount of economic power could be hurt under capitalism. So it was important to educate the poorest of the folks, because they were the ones that more apt moving forward would be hurt by capitalism. So you needed to sort of essentially build a net of sorts to essentially keep them um, at a pace that they can keep up with the rest of society, because you could fall behind and become exploited under capitalism. So yes, he had faith in capitalism, but also acknowledged some of the shortcomings that could possibly happen in capitalism. Now, the other thing that he was an advocate for was the idea of he was a labor advocate, sort of. And so this idea, number one, he did believe in the idea of um, becoming an expert in one specific aspect of your job to a certain extent. Again, yes, but not overly so. And so, have you guys ever heard of the phrase Fordism? I guess in Europe, that started before Fordism was Taylorism. You guys ever heard of Taylorism or Fordism? Yes, it has to do with Henry Ford. Well, I know a lot more about Fordism than I do Taylorism, so I'll stick to Fordism. Um, so essentially, Henry Ford, who built the Model T, um, I think it was the first popular car in the United States. But anyways, in order to mass produce these Model Ts or these Fords, what Ford created was a line, assembly line of sorts. Well, actually, it was an assembly line. An assembly line where essentially each person does their task along the assembly line. And so what Ford discovered was that if you make people an expert at that one specific task, you can produce a lot more cars a lot faster, right? If you make a person an expert in, like, for instance, putting in the wheels, for instance, on the assembly line of the car, you just make them an expert in that one aspect. You become very efficient at it, very good at it. You can do it very quickly, and over time, you can mass produce cars at a faster pace if you practice this idea of the assembly line or Fordism. Um, and so Right, exactly, Jack. This idea of the assembly workers, that's exactly right. Efficiency, right. And so this idea of efficiency or making them experts meant that you can build cars at a faster clip. And so he was an advocate of that. He thought that was a good thing. Now, unfortunately, one of the things that I liked about Adam Smith was that there's kind of a double-edged sword to everything, is that sure, they become an expert at putting in the wheels in a car, but if that's all you do, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, you eventually start to suffer from what they call mental mutilation. You start losing perspective um, on society. You get lost. You start losing the idea of martial spirit. In other words, you stop being a critical thinker. You start thinking for yourself. You kind of zone out. In other words, so for example, you get. Do you guys see the nets on the bottom of this building?
Yes.
Suicide nets. That is right. So I want to say these are outside of Foxconn. And so Foxconn is the place that builds phones. Well, it's not so they don't jump off, it's so they don't kill themselves. So they do jump off, but it catches them because the Chinese and again, Foxconn I do believe built phones, the iPhone, and I think they still build the iPhone. And so essentially, right, according to reports that I've heard, is that the Chinese bosses treat the workers very poorly, and they have them sitting in these areas, and they work, long hours, becoming highly specialized, yes, at making these phones and doing this one specific task. But they go crazy over time. And so what was happening was because they were going crazy, these workers, they were jumping out of these buildings and committing suicide. And so what the Chinese did was that they essentially built suicide nets, right? This idea of essentially to prevent workers from committing suicide, they would put these nets so they can catch them, so they wouldn't be able to kill themselves. So, this would be the dark side of what Adam Smith is talking about, this idea of mental mutilation, this idea of just losing your ability to critically think, this idea that essentially you're just going crazy because you're doing the same task over and over and over and over again. You just kind of lose it and you'd rather kill yourself than keep working at this one task. And so it's nuts. It is nuts. And so so this is the dark side of capitalism, right? So it's something to bear in mind. So what Adam Smith thought was important, so this is why, yes, he thought that becoming an expert was really important, but he also believed in this idea of human labor being really important, especially if the labor has some skills to contribute to their bosses, dexterity, has good judgment, that essentially, right, that companies should have technology um, that matches with human capital. In other words, yes, make them experts in this one specific task, but give them technology so they can do their job better, so they won't suffer from mental mutilation and won't jump out of buildings and kill themselves because they're treated so poorly by their bosses. So it is pretty sad. Well, I also think it's, and I don't know how you necessarily solve this. I still think, I'm pretty sure that Foxconn still makes iPhones, right, for Apple. And so yeah, so yeah, it's sad when you think about it, right? That the idea that we're buying, I have an iPhone, so yeah, the idea that we're buying phones from places like this where they don't treat their workers very well, so much so that they want to kill themselves. Woo, Alyssa, true words have never been spoken. It is challenging to be a consumer, and it's just really hard to really know where you're getting your stuff from. It's just hard. It's 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 very challenging in this global economy, um, to track down the origins of products. And yeah, even the idea of cobalt, where the cobalt is what you need, I think, for the phone as well. And so even that. So any other questions, comments? Yes, that's true, Jack. But even if you're informed, it's hard. It's 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 really difficult. It's difficult. But at least you can try to make more informed decisions in terms of where you're buying your stuff from. But it's it's hard. It's hard. Any other comments about good old Adam Smith before we move on? Not to start on such a downer. No other questions? All right, so moving on to Karl Marx. So one of the important things to understand about Karl Marx, right, is that he actually does live under capitalism. He sees the emergence of the Industrial Revolution, right, that's happening in the 19th century. And so, he has the privilege, I guess, of hindsight, right, 2020, that he sees that, well, these things that Adam Smith was saying about capitalism didn't bear out to be true. That essentially Karl Marx and Engels both argue that essentially the worker under capitalism is actually treated even worse than they were under mercantilism, and the consumer really doesn't benefit all that much either. And so this idea of workers being exploited under capitalism is sort of a theme that you should really bear in mind and remember. And so the way Karl Marx saw the world was this idea of the bourgeois, right? The boss, and this idea of the proletarian, the worker, and this idea that the proletarian, the worker, is exploited by the bourgeois, right? And so, according to Marx, right, the commodity is something that is bought, sold, and exchanged in the market, and that makes perfect sense. Per se, there's nothing wrong with that per se. The issue is that oftentimes is that labor is considered to be a commodity, and that's what Marx had an issue with. So workers' use value must exceed their exchange values. In other words, especially in the world of entertainment and sports, right? People, athletes, actors are considered commodities, right? The worker or the athlete or the actor or actress, they have a use value for their boss. This is how much they're worth for the studios or the networks, right? And as long as their exchange value, which means their worth for other people, exceeds their use value, in other words, the boss is, when they pay that athlete $10 million a year, if they're making more money off of that um, athlete, right? Let's say they're making 15, $20 million off that athlete, they keep paying that particular athlete. So they're using the athlete or the star's use value and paying them, and they're happily paying them as long as their exchange value exceeds their use value. And so the bourgeois, right? The owners, the studio heads, these folks are profiting off of the labor and the workers don't really profit from their labor. He refers to this as a theory of exploitation. So I know some of us would think, well, what do you mean Tom Cruise is being exploited? What do you mean LeBron James is being exploited? Well, Karl Marx and Engels would say, yes, they're getting paid very well. But I mean, the the owner is getting paid so much more off of their profits, right? Like if it was really sort of a free market, then those athletes, right, or those actors and actresses would be making way more money. And so at the end of the day, right, he believes that laborers are exploited. Now, of course, the Tom Cruises and the LeBron James are not being exploited nearly as much as, let's say, the rookie who's playing in his first year contract, or the marginal player that is making like the bare minimum, or the actor and actress that don't make nearly the amount of money that, let's say, a Tom Cruise does, or a Tom Hanks does, or an Angela Jolie, or all those sorts of folks. So the key is, right, is that the workers are going to be living under these conditions where they're exploited. And this is all going to change one day, that eventually into this class warfare, eventually the worker, right, the proletarian is going to rise up, revolt, and it's going to take over society, and society is going to be better because it's going to be a more equitable society where now the workers are the bosses, essentially, and things will be better. Now, who is he placing a lot of faith in? The workers, right? The workers. Now, is it necessarily true that workers make better bosses or better folks?
No.
No. And yes, it depends. Sometimes the worker might be, and sometimes the worker is not. It does depend. And so this is probably a bad example, but you guys familiar with the riots that went on in Seattle? I think they're still going on, mind you. And so there was like an organ, I want to say they were a Marxist organization that sort of took over. Chaz, thank you, Jack. Um, Chaz, right, just took over this little area of Seattle, and they put barricades and all these sorts of things. And by the accounts of some, right, actually, they ended up doing a worse job of being the bosses than what was actually in place prior to that, until the cops went in and I think they took it all down. But that's kind of an example of the people who are rising up and revolting. If they become powerful and take over power, they don't always necessarily become better bosses. The thing is, right, with power, is that power is intoxicating. Once you got it, it's hard to give it up. So that's the thing. And so a lot of people critique Marx for this belief, for having too much faith in the worker. So what else was I going to say? So Marx saw society as sort of these two components, and this is important. Is this idea of the base and this idea of the superstructure. And the idea of the base, right, is that it supports and determines the working relations of between the boss and the worker, right? So how are the workers treated at the base? Are they getting abused? Are they being treated well? Those sorts of things. And the base is also the place where ideology becomes embedded in content. So Marx, if he was still alive, would say the movies that we watch have an embedded ideology that reflects the ideology of the powerful, for instance. Now, the other thing that Marx critiques is this idea that he was very critical of technology. He felt that technology hurts workers. So again, he was living under the era of the Industrial Revolution. he saw that, that machines, just where people are now working on machines, and these machines never stopped, right? It used to be that he used to work in the farm, that you would work from sun up to sundown, and obviously you can't work in the dark in agriculture. But with machines, you can work all day. You can literally, a machine never stops until it breaks. And so he felt that essentially, right, that technology actually doesn't help the worker, it hurts the worker. Some would say this idea that we're working online, that it actually is an example of hurting us. And it's, I can kind of see their point, because when I was your age in college, the internet was just starting. And so if you wanted to see our professor, we had to sit outside of their office, literally sit in front of the office and wait for the professor to show up at their office. And, we go in and chit chat with him or her. Nowadays, with technology, because of the phone, right, I can get message from you guys or ladies at midnight, right? So essentially, if I choose to look at my phone, if anything, my office hours are no longer what I just say on the syllabus, but they're also, how often I choose to look at my phone. And so essentially, Marx would argue is that the phone is making us work more, not work less. That essentially we're always on, and we're always doing labor um, with our phone nowadays.
Can I jump in and say something? Like
Sure.
that sentence speaks out to me when you said, technology doesn't help, it hurts the worker. Because it makes me think when I was at Target and I worked at self-checkout, I would have customers come in, or as we call it, the guests, and they would say, hey, they should have you on a cashier, you don't really do a lot. And I'm all like, well, I mean, I'm just monitoring, making sure that no one steals anything, but point is that I don't know, I just got that idea that what if in the future, we won't even have cashiers anymore, because with self-checkout things going on. Exactly, Alyssa. Yeah, so my point is I can see where Marx is coming from when he says that it hurts the worker, because
Yeah,
technology will take over everything.
This idea of robots, for instance, doing our labor.
Exactly.
Right? Which,
I know that.
That's an excellent point, Shelby.
I was just gonna say, I know there's an Amazon store opening up off of Harbor and Orangethorpe, I think, right next to the Costco. There's like this big Costco.
Yeah, I know where it's at. I've been there.
Yeah, I think, I don't know if it's an Amazon Fresh or not, but anyway, I'm not sure if they're, because I know Amazon they already have a store in like New York City, and I think up like in San Francisco, where basically they don't even have like employees working there, like in-person employees, or maybe they'll have like very little compared to like what a normal grocery store like a Ralph's would have or something like that. So it might just be kind of like the Amazon where you throw it in your basket and it detects that you threw it in your basket, and then it charges you, and if you take it out, it like takes it off your bill or whatever. So it's pretty crazy.
Interesting. I'm gonna meet, yes, Krista. I am Christina. I'm also very curious to see how this is all going to work out. It's going to be interesting. I've only seen pictures of the one in Seattle. At least I think it's the one in Seattle. But my friend has gone to the one in Seattle because he lives in the Seattle area. But it's interesting to see how it's going to work out here in Southern California. Is there one in Irvine, Helena? Huh.
Yes,
I
there
don't
is
know about the one in
Irvine.
Irvine.
It's like in Irvine, like Tustin Marketplace in front of it. And there's a shopping cart, like as you were saying, you just put it in and it's gonna scan everything and tells you the price. But right now there is still workers at the end that kind of help you check out.
Huh. I kind of want to check it out just to see what it's like.
It's pretty cool. And you can, like, at the end, you just push the card on like a green surface on the ground, and
Mm-hmm.
pretty much as telling you to like check out, and you can see everything you spent, and then you get the receipt on your Amazon account.
Interesting. Okay. So there's no cashiers or there's nothing.
There is some because they still have normal shopping carts if you want to, but no, for this one there is no cashier.
Interesting. You're right, Caroline. Perfect for introverts. Interesting. Okay. That's well, and then the decision, right, is that is this good for, yes, it's good for, for the boss, right? Is it Bezos? But is it good for the workers? So moving forward, if this is the model we're going to use, I would say maybe not. Yeah, Bezos makes a lot of money. He's a very rich guy. And so again, right, this technology herd will help us. It just really depends. And it's going to be interesting moving forward. This is why I sort of like Andrew Yang's idea of the universal wage, until sort of like this idea of we all get sort of a wage, a living wage, and so we can figure it out as we move forward. I kind of like that idea, but I know he and I lost out eventually. But
I was also gonna say that like how we were talking about the Amazon stores for introverts, even like with Zoom classes, I've been noticing that a lot of people are kind of becoming introverts because we're getting so used to like staying in our own space, going online. So like having that kind of shopping experience could like definitely shift not just like the way we consume, but like just the way we are and the way we socialize. Like people might start to prefer technology and like kind of form their own little bubbles instead of like how we used to just go out and interact with people.
so your fear is that eventually technology is going to become a substitute for humans.
Kind of, not really like substitute, but basically people are gonna kind of feel more comfortable with it and oftentimes choose technology over like a social interaction.
Right. They're going to prefer over socializing with human beings. That's one of the fears that a lot of people have, is this idea that in some ways, right, that humans will become more expendable as we become more in love or connected to technology. That's one fear of some people. I mean, that kind of freaks me out too, but I think that's more, I think I'll be dead before that happens. I think that will be an issue that you guys will have to deal with moving forward. I think this is something that's going to be 20, 30 years down the road, maybe.
You know, it's sad. There's a story. We went to Olive Garden, and my sister said that she saw like the mom and dad sitting with the son and the two sons, and you know how they give out like those little like coloring books for the kids.
Yes.
Well, like it turns out that when they turned to see like the family, they noticed that the two boys were on the phones, on the iPads, and then the two parents were actually the ones coloring. Which was sad, you know, it's the complete opposite. I was so sad.
This isolation thing is tough.
I think it's interesting because I think a lot of kids are being raised like if a kid was born, let's say a year before the pandemic started or the lockdown started back March in 2020, these like young kids are being basically like raised in an environment like in the last 10 months, 11 months where they don't know any connection to the outside world. So they basically every time that they like once kind of things go back to I guess you could say normal or kids go back to like interacting with other kids, they're going to have like a really hard time because basically they're going to be inside. All they ever knew was like inside at their home with their, family, with their immediate family members maybe. So I think it's going to be kind of interesting to see how like young children basically like go back to school and go back to like socializing with other young kids and other teachers and stuff like that.
It's going to be unusual. I have my wife has a little niece that I think she's 5. And her first year of kindergarten is actually through Zoom. And so if, when we go back to whatever normal is, it's going to be interesting to see how she does, right, in the first grade or second grade, whenever this vaccination really is distributed to a large number of folks. Yeah, Jack. My little son, who's right now he's 2 years and 4 months. We were planning to send him to preschool starting at the age of 2, but all the preschools are essentially kind of closed, and so we haven't been able to send him to preschool, unfortunately. And I think it's affecting his development, and just in terms of like grasping knowledge and those sorts of things. I think that he'd be catching on a lot faster if he was hanging out with other little kids, and kind of breaks my heart a little bit. Oh, wow. Yeah, don't be afraid of people, Alyssa. That's not good. But I see what you're saying. So one other thing before we move on from the base is this idea of the superstructure, right? One more thing I was going to show you before I went talking about the base. This is a good example of how, if you ever watched the documentary Artifact, it puts down a good example of how with modern technology, actually, the musician or the artist has become even more exploited by the industry. So think about even the idea of streaming and the idea of how hard it is to make money for an artist through streaming.
I've never heard of a label that doesn't screw an artist. You talk to anybody who audits their label, they're always owed money. And if nothing else, usually the label holds back enough money that your cost of auditing is such that you won't do it. So that's the business model, is screwing the artists.
Their financial practices have been shady since the beginning of time. It's been grandfathered in since the 50s and 60s when rock and roll really started.
In the 50s, they were screwing the artists then, but there was much, much less money involved. Then as you start to go into the 60s and 70s, the hit-to ratio is so bad that they're saying, hey, we can't pay the hit artist because he's paying for all the bad artists.
It goes back to how the music industry was set up in the very early stages of the recording industry, taking advantage of uneducated, easily swayed artists who don't really care about the money.
Unfortunately, there's a lot of fallout with still with bands getting paid. We had to sue our label to get paid.
And they've created this strange, convoluted system that you have to be a lawyer to really understand, or a mathematician.
A typical record deal is structured something like this. The record label gives in advance, say $250,000 to the artist to record an album. The artist then records the album. Suppose that the album sells 500,000 copies at $10 each, yielding $5 million. The record label then takes their cut out of the $5 million, typically 85% of the total sales, leaving the artist with $750,000. But before the artist receives any payments, the label first deducts the advance. In addition, the record label recoups other costs such as recording costs, half the promotion costs, half the video costs, and tour support. This leaves the artist $425,000 in debt to the record label. And then this debt gets carried on to the next album, and the next album.
I don't know if most people have seen long-form contracts. They're insane, and there's all these little things thrown in. It's kind of like legislature for a government. They put up this big issue, but underneath that issue, there's like 17 other little laws that they threw in that they're not talking about. So when you say yes to this one thing, you're actually saying yes to like 45 other things.
There's a worse one. They used to have damage fees with digital downloads. Digital downloads, like at first they were doing that, like they just trying to get away with murder, just like, let's leave it in there, let's see if the lawyer sees it kind of thing.
Some other hidden items that the contract includes are packaging costs. They deduct up to 25% of the artist's cut, known as a royalty, to cover the expense of plastic cases and artwork. This cost is even administered to digital downloads where packaging is non-existent. 10% is deducted to cover breakage costs during shipping. This started in the vinyl era, continued when CDs replaced vinyl, and still applies today with digital downloads. The 10% free goods deduction is an antiquated system where retailers purchase 100 albums but are given an additional 10 albums at no charge. Since the artist is only paid on albums sold, they are not compensated for those free albums. This deduction still continues even in a digitally dominated market.
Artists generate so much money for so many people that have nothing to do with the creative process at all.
So Marx would say this is an example, right, of how technology, even though it's been progressing in the world of entertainment, it still ultimately hurts the worker, in this case, the artist. You did watch this video in 346, but now we're attaching theory to it, Shelby. But yes, it is crazy. Well, a lot of artists are now choosing to start their own label and try to work outside the system that's been constructed. So yes, you're right. I'm not sure about Chance the Rapper per se, but I know a lot of artists that are powerful enough to start their own labels are now starting to try to work outside the system because the system doesn't benefit them. Any other questions about the video? So the other part of human society, unless there's other questions. So the other part of human society is the superstructure that reinforces the base. So the idea of the kind of education you received is embedded with the ideology of the rich and the powerful. The media you see is embedded with the ideology of the rich and the powerful. The religion, et cetera, et cetera. So the way that Marx saw society, this is the way he's seen society, right? The base and the superstructure, and notice the rotation that goes around. So I guess the question that I have for you is that does Marx really see society really evolving and changing? Right. So generally speaking, right, according to this model, Marx's model, society doesn't really shift very much, right? I mean, it might shift a little, but really at the end of the day, it's just circular, right? At the end of the day, the ideology that we receive that's been embedded at the base is circulated to the superstructure, and it just keeps going in a circular motion, in a sense that the people who are seeing, the media also sort of adopt that ideology that's being embedded at the base, and they reproduce the same sort of media with the same sort of ideology. This is why, according to Marx, the politics isn't going to shift much. Our idea of what is a nuclear family doesn't shift much. Religion doesn't shift much, and education doesn't shift much in terms of the ideology that it represents. It works in a circular motion, and so society doesn't evolve much, according to Marx. Maybe that's true, Jack. But some people might say that actually technology keeps us from advancing. If that makes any sense. So the one thing that we get from the base, this is also sort of important, is this idea of the false consciousness. And we also get this from the superstructure, mind you. And this idea of the false consciousness that you're going to read in chapter, I think it's 1 or 2, I can't remember what chapter talks about the false consciousness. But you have to understand that the false consciousness is essentially, right, this idea that institutions and the elites mislead the lower class by disseminating a distorted view of society. And what makes it distorted is the fact that we essentially, over time, we being the lower class or the workers, right, essentially adopt the ideology of the institutions and the elites. The reason it's considered to be a false consciousness is that it doesn't, at the end of the day, this ideology doesn't benefit us. It's a false consciousness. We've been misled to think that it actually does benefit us, but at the end of the day, it really doesn't. It only benefits the powerful institutions, and it only benefits the powerful elite people who are profiting off of our labor. Now, the example that I'm giving you is the idea of meritocracy, this idea that you earn your place in society, right, through just simply hard work. You earn it, right? There's no such thing as luck or anything like that. You earn your place in society. And I mean, is that 100%, is that true that we earn our place in society through just simply merit?
I say sometimes, like, if you work hard for things, you can be able to achieve what you want. But also there are people who are like born into very wealthy families who are just given basically everything and don't really have to do much for it. So I think it just depends on the person.
Yes, thank you. Well said.
I agree.
So yes, at times it's true. It is definitely true that you can be a nobody and become a somebody. It is 100% accurate. That is true. And then there's also true that, some folks already have status, they already have wealth, and they were lucky. They were born into it, right? They didn't earn that. They were born into it. And so the idea of meritocracy, what makes it so powerful, right, essentially, is that it's not 100% false. There's some truth to that. This idea, yes, Caroline, there is social mobility. That you can go from, working class to very well off. It is possible through some hard work, some luck, but it is certainly possible that you can do it. No question. Each and every one of you can be very, very wealthy with some hard work, actually a lot of hard work, and some luck along the way. You can become very successful. But at the same time, right, is it your fault 100% if you don't succeed, right? For whatever reason, you grew up in a terrible neighborhood with terrible parents, and you know you don't amount to much. Is it your fault if you don't become successful?
I was just gonna say I agree with Danny. I think another big thing, like besides money, I would say the second biggest thing is like being born into a family with like a lot of connections, because like your dad or your mom or whoever could have those connections, and that can really help you compared to somebody whose, parents might work in a very simple job and doesn't have those kinds of connections. You might not get that financial support from your parents, but you will have that connection support, especially in a time where like LinkedIn is like so popular and stuff like that. I think that connections are going to become almost like a way of power and a way of getting a better job as time goes on.
Yes, what you're referring to is social capital, not necessarily capital like monetary capital, social capital, right? You're right. Like my son, for instance, my sons, because I have another son that's on the way, they're going to have social capital that I never had, never in my life had growing up. Both of my parents were, my mom was from Mexico, didn't receive much of an education. My dad was born here, but also didn't graduate from high school. Very working class, very little social capital. But my sons aren't necessarily going to have to worry about that. They're going to have, I have lots of connections. I know lots of folks that can help them moving forward. Yes, Alyssa, no question. Your gender, your race, all those sorts of things are potential obstacles for you to meet your potential, right? And so, and the idea of the false consciousness and this distorted view is that if you don't succeed, right, for whatever reason, it doesn't acknowledge these things. Like Alyssa was pointing out, the idea of race or gender, it doesn't acknowledge the fact that, well, we still kind of live in this misogynistic society. There is this element of racism that does exist in our society. There is this element of classism, heck, in our society. Forget about just the idea of race. There's classism as well. And so these factors, prevent you from meeting your potential, whatever that potential is. Yes, Christina, this is why I tell you guys, join clubs, make connections. What I'm telling you, all of you, is that build that social capital.
I was gonna say also, like, for your last question, when you were asking, like, is it your fault if you're born into a really bad situation, let's say. I just think it's important to touch on the fact that you said luck, because I think luck is a huge factor, because people, for example, musicians, they can be extremely talented and have like everything that they need to be famous, but it's just the amount of luck they have to be able to get to that status of like a very high well-known artist. So people who are like very born into basically a bad situation, they can work very hard and they can do everything they can, but if they end up failing in the end, I don't necessarily think it's their fault, because I think that they might just not have had the luck, because they could have like worked for it and tried to be better and do whatever they could. But I think luck is a really important factor, as well as working hard and being able to get to that place.
Well said. Yeah, I think that both are equally important. You got to put in the time, and you got to be a little bit lucky, but you have to put in the time. Was it Jay-Z? I think it was Jay-Z. Jay-Z talks about the fact that he got kind of lucky, right? That because he used to sell drugs before he became, this billionaire. And I think he was talking, I can't remember who he was talking to. He's talking to, I think, David Letterman. And he's talking about the fact that, there was this one time he was supposed to go out and with a friend, and I guess they're going to do some sort of drug deal. And he didn't go for whatever reason. And the friend got caught and busted. And I think the friend ended up in prison. He says that, that could have been him, right? If he had gone, there may not be a Jay-Z. So it's important to acknowledge the fact that, yes, you have to put in the work, but you also, there is an element of luck as well. So if you don't succeed, the problem is that too often, right, we blame the individual and don't blame the system for people's failings. That's all I'm trying to say. Yes, sometimes we are our own worst enemies, and the reason we don't succeed is because of us. But sometimes, right, the system fails us at times. And it's hard to distinguish the two sometimes because it's hard to tell.
Rebecca Black got lucky with Friday. Remember
Well,
that song? Yeah.
Yeah. Other points. So the idea of the false consciousness, right? And this is referring to bread and circles. So this was coined by a poet by the name of Juvenal, who witnessed the fall of Rome. And one of the things that happened during the fall of Rome is that people became very addicted to entertainment, and this idea that we'd go watch the gladiators fight, but not pay attention to what the politicians were doing. So this idea of the false consciousness, right? This idea that the powers that be, do they use entertainment to keep to remain in power, to distract us, to keep us under a false consciousness? So therefore, they can practice no sound public policy. They can do whatever they do because they know at the end of the day, because we're so distracted with all these other things, that at the end of the day, we really can't govern ourselves and take care of ourselves. And so some people say that, what we're experiencing in the United States is similar to what happened with the fall of Rome, right? And so, now I don't know if that's true or not, but some people would argue that we're headed down the same path potentially. And then again, I don't know. A couple other points before I conclude the lecture is this idea of the commodity fetishism. Some of you have already pointed this out or alluded to this. And the issue, one of the biggest issues that Marx has with capitalism is this idea that we place way too much importance, right, on the commodity. As a matter of fact, we place more importance on the commodity than we do on the human labor, right? So we want the latest and greatest phone, or we get the cheapest garment possible, those sorts of things, and we don't actually appreciate the human labor, right? And so he believes that we need to acknowledge human labor, and that oftentimes it's not, we don't do it. And this is the reason why society doesn't get better, is because we don't acknowledge the human labor. And if we wanted a better society, we actually need to actually value human labor more than we actually value the commodity. And so under capitalism, right, Marx believes that humans lose their humanity, their destiny, their ability to interact with one another, because we're all like doing our jobs. And so this is a byproduct of what he calls a class society. This is what he refers also, that's a theory of alienation, this idea we become, under capitalism, we become alienated from the worker, and so therefore we don't understand the labor that they do, and therefore we just end up valuing the commodity versus the actual labor put into making the phone. And so this is an important part of, this is the reason why, for his opinion, that labor gets exploited under capitalism, is that we don't appreciate human labor. The one thing that he did want from us, he being Marx, is that he wanted art to have a Marxist aesthetic, something that depicted class realism. He said that if art was more apt to reflect the plight of the worker, that society would improve. So in closing, right, this is an example of what I mean by the Marxist aesthetic. So this is a famous mural painted by Diego Rivera. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Mexican artist. And this is a painting of him, I want to say it's Detroit. And he was basically painting the workers' experience as they're working in this, what kind of plant is this? I want to say it's automobile plant, I want to say. But as you can see here, if you really study the painting, you can see the amount of labor that these workers are putting forth in order to build these products. And Marx believes that if we actually saw this, right, and really experienced this in more detail and saw it more in our pop culture, that we would be more apt to value the labor that went into making these products versus rather than putting value on solely the product. It is true, Jack. So any other questions on Marx, on Adam Smith? We actually didn't get to many slides today. That's good. You guys talked. Good. Talking is good. So I talk less. That's good. Well, I'm gonna provide you with all this information as a recording, Caroline. Yes. All this is being recorded. So you can always just pause it there. Yes, Christina, the slides will be on Canvas for all of you to review.
Thank you. And then could you also make them downloadable too, the PowerPoints? Would that be okay? Like you've done before?
The PowerPoint downloadable. You mean the PowerPoint separate from the video?
Yeah. Por favor.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other last questions on Marx, his view of labor, his view of classes, of capitalism, why he didn't have faith in capitalism, and why he didn't agree with Adam Smith? No questions? All right, so on Wednesday, or even before that, maybe even today, if my son goes to sleep, I will also upload the lecture for Wednesday, so you guys can tackle it earlier. You don't have to wait till Wednesday necessarily to start listening to the recordings. For the recordings, you'll have the recording embedded, but also the PowerPoint, so you can add on your notes to whatever you want onto the PowerPoint, which I guess, not sure who was asking for that on the for the video, but I can do that also for the video, do the video and the PowerPoint. So I guess you can write notes onto the PowerPoint slides. Might be a good idea. Any last questions?
Is that PowerPoint just going to be a continuation of this, or is it going to be a separate?
It's a continuation of this.
Okay.
The next PowerPoint slides center on the Frankfurt School and how they got started. The Frankfurt School essentially are a group of folks, scholars, that started in Germany, and they were very critical of Leninism, or essentially communism, and they were very critical of capitalism. They saw that those two forces played a huge role in helping World War II to start, and how they used media in a very strategic way to help World War II start.
This class ends at what time? 11:15?
Class is over.
Nice. How's your day? Going good?
Going good.
Good to hear. Good to hear.
Some family members are sick with COVID, unfortunately, which is not good. But
I couldn't hear you. What'd you say?
some of my family members are sick with COVID, so that's not good.
Oh, I'm sorry, man.
Yeah. So couple of bad cases. So hopefully they can pull through.
I'll be praying for them.
Yep.
Wishing them the best.
Me too. But one certainly does not look good. For sure. Yes, me too. Hope for the best. But anyways, have a good week, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Professor. Have a good week. See
All
you
right,
next
you too.
Thank you, Professor.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, class.
Thank you. Have a good week.
Thank you.